In this series, we are going to be walking through everything you need to know about MySQL to get started building dynamic web applications. And these dynamic web applications are going to be storing data, they're going to be pulling data. So, really, any web application you can think of that stores and then retrieves data later on, which is pretty much most websites now that you can interact with in that way. Even something as simple as posting a comment or contacting a company or something like that. We'll be doing this, and we'll be using PHP with MySQL to create a contact form at the end of the series. So from what you'll learn in the series, you'll be able to use this in a real life application. So honestly, once you've learned the very basics of working with MySQL, and especially coupling this with PHP, you will be able to go on to create anything really. Obviously, more advanced applications require more advanced queries, so you'll have to change the queries that you use. We'll be looking at queries later. However, once you have the basics of just reading and writing, really everything becomes a lot easier because you've already picked up the knowledge to actually go ahead and insert, retrieve, and you can just go ahead and structure things based on your requirements. So, what is MySQL? Well, basically, it is one of the most popular, or probably the most popular, database storage solution. It's open source, so anyone can see its code, contribute to it, which is probably what's made it such a good and popular product. And it's obviously free to download, so you don't need to pay anything to start building these web applications. PHP's free as well, so when you couple that with a free web server like Apache or many of the other web servers that are around, you can go ahead and just start getting started for free. Basically, there's no need to pay any money. So the basics of getting up and running with MySQL are this. You'll install it on your computer on its own. You can create databases, tables, insert data, manipulate that data, which obviously we'll be looking at later. And on its own, it does have its uses, because if you install a database on, if you've ever used anything like Microsoft Access, this does have its uses. You can perform queries, you can extract data, insert new data, and you pretty much just have a database solution. So you can install it without PHP or without web server and just start using it as a database. However, it becomes more interesting when you start to couple it with a web server and a programming language like PHP and a web server like Apache, which is what we'll be doing in this series. So this lets you use, basically, when you couple these two things together, so you have your database solution as MySQL, PHP is your language, and Apache obviously just to access everything and serve files. This lets you use PHP to connect to MySQL, query it from your code, so you can perform queries to insert, update, delete data, and you basically bake this into your web application. So when a user performs an action, you could then issue a query to your database that would then store something. So if this sounds confusing to you, don't worry. We'll be looking at installing MAMP, since I'm using OS X, which is basically a software solution that installs Apache, the web server, PHP, the programming language we're using, and MySQL, which is obviously the database solution, and then we'll be instantly ready to start building. Now, obviously, if you're using something like Windows or Linux, don't worry, there are solutions available for this as well, which is great because they're so easy to install, and the concept is generally the same. The way they work, the way you start each server is maybe different. They have their own control panels. They might be placed in a different location, but generally, it's very, very easy to get started with these things. So, but before we do any of that and install, we'll be installing MAMP, but before we look at Apache or PHP, we'll actually just be looking at accessing MySQL using the terminal. So the MySQL monitor, if you like. This is because it's extremely important to understand the fundamentals of MySQL or SQL in general before you go on to start using PHP. Now, I'll speak about SQL. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, which is basically the code, if you like, or the queries that you write to extract data from a database. So, for example, if you wanted to pull out a certain user, you can structure your query to pull out the data that specifically relates to that user, or to that record or whatever you're storing. It obviously varies greatly, but it generally flows quite well, nicely like language. So it's fairly easy to sort of get going with it. So before we go on to PHP, we're going to look at the basics, and it's a good way to start. So don't worry, it's not as boring as it sounds. It can actually be quite fun and liberating to use the command line, issue your commands, build up your database, or create your database initially, build it up, start building tables, structuring your tables, inserting data, and just generally building up your database. And then what we'll do is we'll go over to PHP and start using this to insert, pull out records, and we'll look at doing this in a secure way as well. So we'll talk a little bit about security, which is extremely important. So let's move over to the next part, where we'll be looking at installing MAMP, or obviously the equivalent if you're using Windows or Linux, so we can actually get started.